Everyone knows first impressions are important, and video games are no exception. If a new game doesn't hook you in early on, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time playing it. And one of the very first things every player notices is how the game looks. Now, of course, gameplay and content are the more critical factors in determining a player's enjoyment, but that doesn't mean graphical appeal should be overlooked either. After all, video games are a visual medium, and the more immersive a game looks, all the more reason to like it. For some games, their unique style can even be a main selling point. But an art style can also convey just what kind of tone its game is going for, as well as providing a hint for just what its world has in store for you. For example, if a game looks pretty realistic, you would likewise expect its story and setting to be pretty realistic as well. And one game that I think perfectly captures everything it has to offer just by showing off its art style alone is Team Fortress 2. No matter what your first exposure to TF2 was, whether it was the gameplay itself or one of Valve's animated shorts, no doubt one of the first things you noticed was its unique cartoonish appearance, which, given the nature of the game's content, might strike you as a rather odd design choice. Out of context, TF2 does sound like a pretty gruesome game, and that's because, when you get down to it, it kinda is. Your average in-game match has no shortage of brutal carnage. I mean, you have players getting decapitated, impaled, and burned alive. And that's just on top of all the relative normal violence that comes from a shooter. If this game looked any more realistic, these absurd acts of war crimes would probably be more noticeable. But that's just it. TF2 is very clearly not a realistic game. But questionable cosmetic additions aside, the general look of the game remains pretty eye-catching. Even back when TF2 was only in beta, the stylized graphics really helped made it stand out from the crowd of other shooter games. While not the first game to have such an art style, for shooters at the time, TF2 was something different, something unique. Or as one of Valve's developers put it,
the game wasn't visually distinct from our other products. A stylized world had none of these problems. A Team Fortress 2 screenshot is easily recognizable, ensuring that no one will confuse it with another one of our games.
And when you combine this cartoonish design with Valve's top-notch humor and polish, you get a game with a pretty distinctive sense of identity. Ever since its release, the look of TF2 has become iconic among first-person shooters, and its influence can still be felt today. Whenever a new shooter game with stylized graphics roll out, you can expect at least one person will make an immediate comparison with Team Fortress 2. But for as influential TF2's style is now, it didn't always look like this. As a matter of fact, TF2 was an almost completely different game entirely. Yep, back in 1999, this is what someone thought of when they heard Team Fortress 2. And when Valve first showed off this footage, it was more or less what their vision for the game was at the time. But this is clearly not the same game we all know and love today. So how do you go from this to this? Well, the reason Team Fortress 2 had such a realistic appearance in the first place is because TF2 is, surprisingly, a sequel to an older game, Team Fortress Classic. And the reason Team Fortress Classic had a realistic look is because it originally started out as a mod for Half-Life. So when Valve decided to create a sequel, it made sense to keep with the gritty tone. But as production went on, the development team began to encounter the consistency problems that tend to pop up in a real-world setting. In the otherwise apparently logical world the team had decided to place the game in, certain gameplay features just didn't make any sense. Like, why would two opposing forces build their bases directly across from each other? How can the soldier possibly survive blasting a rocket launcher directly beneath him? And how is the medic capable of healing people with a magical beam of feel-good juice? The development team was afraid that the player's suspension of disbelief would be pushed to the point of immersion breaking once faced with these necessities. A more pressing matter was that they were having trouble conveying certain information about how the game worked through grounded visuals. The classes were too similar in appearance, making it difficult to differentiate between them, and some weapon effects didn't quite grab players' attentions enough. So when the limitations of reality proved to be too restrictive, Valve decided to approach TF2 with a drastically different vision. After trying several different looks, the design team ultimately decided to take inspiration from early to mid 20th century artwork. Primarily from the works of Norman Rockwell and J.C. Leyendecker, whose distinctive illustrations provided just the right kind of balance between style and realism that the team was looking for. These graphics were able to be replicated within the source engine through a combination of cel shading and lighting effects alongside newly produced rendering technology that was exclusive to the source engine at the time. In particular was a technique called rim lighting, which saw extensive usage in order to make the classes stand out from the background. Speaking of classes, the new art style meant that the concern of players misidentifying what character the enemy was playing as was no longer an issue. From just their silhouette alone, each class is easily recognizable. When it came down to character design, Valve had a list of priorities that had to be immediately identified as soon as one player spotted another. First, what team are they on? Second, what class are they? And third, what weapon are they using? No matter the distance or lighting, a blue sniper using the classic is not going to be confused with a red medic using the quick fix. But the overall shape is only a part of what makes each class unique from one another. Every detail on a certain class's model tells you just a little bit of what kind of character they are, including the weapons themselves. While it would have been sufficient to simply make stylized versions of various weapons from the time, Valve decided to go the extra mile and made each weapon reflect the personality of its class.
We designed the weapons to look like customized pieces of hardware, personalized and modified by each character to suit his own ends, then focused on musical instruments for secondary and melee weapons.
Now, weapons and playable characters are obviously crucial, but what about the game's world itself? Well, since TF2's art style was based off of illustrations from the mid-20th century, it was only logical to incorporate other popular art elements from the same time span. Instead of a somewhat futuristic setting that matched Team Fortress Classic, Team Fortress 2 was changed into a cartoonishly exaggerated depiction of a vaguely 1950s through 1970s time period. As a result, most maps were designed after Cold War-era military aesthetics. The team also included heavy influences from pop culture at the time, most evidently works from the spy and war film genres, such as Dr. Strangelove and the James Bond series. Likewise, the game's music was also intended to invoke the soundtracks from these classic films. But if you really want to see just how in-depth Valve's artists are, look no further than the official Team Fortress comics, where each one is a reference to a different iconic comic book cover from the time period. In keeping with the bizarre nature of TF2's world, the art movement known as Retrofuturism, aka Raygun Gothic, offered plenty of creative ideas for Valve to implement. Retrofuturism refers to the aesthetic that was popularized in America during the space race, and was a common staple of pulp science fiction throughout the 40s to 60s. It's now considered a signature style of the time, and even today it still shows up in works that tend to romanticize the atomic age. As such, the technology in TF2 is a wonderful, pulpy blend of spy gadgets and retro machinery. And there you have it. It's kind of funny that for as synonymous TF2 and cel-shading graphics are, that it wasn't even Valve's original vision for the game. Personally, I find it pretty amusing how TF2 is essentially one big satirical love letter to the Cold War era, with influences from all over the time period, from classic artwork to pulp comic books. It's obvious to say in hindsight, but evolving the game from a rather generic look to such an unmistakable art style has done wonders for the game's lifespan, and I'm glad they did. I can't picture TF2 in any other way. There really is no other game's art style that quite captures the same unique sense of fun, violence, and pure charm that Team Fortress 2 has.